Hey everybody, it's the Commodore from the Clan of the Grey Wolf, and you are watching the weekly Wringer series here on clanofthegreywolf.com. Now, as we always do in the weekly Wringer, we've got a lot to get to today. Very exciting. Great question that we had last week and a lot of wonderful comments from you all, which keep the show going right along. About video game genres. Actually, a question that was suggested by one of our community members, which I always love to bring to the forefront. So, we're going to answer that question, both from your perspective and from mine, for what that's worth. And then we'll also get to a question next week, which is about animated series, so some of your favorite cartoons. All right, so as I like to do, especially when we have such a great number, is introduce our new people, new folks to the community, new commenters, not necessarily new viewers, but new commenters. We always like to keep that community up and ready to go here in the Weekly Wringer. The community is basically the most important part of what we do. So when we see new folks out there, we have to send them a hearty Clan of the Grey Wolf welcome. All right, so with that being said, let's get right to it. We've got, this week, new folks. Let's see, is that Karo-chan77? That's a cool name. I like that. Neat. Matthias, who had a really cool comment of the day as well. Welcome to both of you. Welcome to Iceman with 2 N's. Don't know if that's significant anywhere. And I'll leave that to you to explain rather than try to guess at it. How about Smoke Pants? That one I'm not even going to take a stab at. I have no idea. Anyway, moving right along. Spin-a-Rooney. Now that's a cool name. I like that one. Spin-a-Rooney. Spin-a-Rooney. Interesting. And let's see. And then also Jim Epcot. At least that's the way I'm going to parse the lettering from your name is Jim Epcot. I'm going to use that. It could be a lot of other things, but I'm going to go with that. Anyway, welcome to all of you. So glad to have you as a part of the Weekly Wringer series, and hope to hear many comments from you in the future as well. All right. Now, as many of you may recall, and I don't see why you wouldn't, unless for some reason you are watching this Weekly Wringer for the first time, and you haven't seen the Weekly Wringer in many, many weeks. But then again, that's the case for every single Weekly Wringer, so I guess that's not really a big deal. Anyway, I'm a little bit weirded out today. I don't know what's going on. Maybe I'm just in a little bit of a mood. Maybe a funk. We got to shake it out. Anyway, last week's question was about video game genres, specifically your least favorite, which is not always something that I definitely ask about, but your least favorite video game genres. Now, that in and of itself, I think, warrants an awesome conversation, right? There are, I think, many conversations that we could have that focus and revolve around the genres of video games, that, you know, the evolution, how things have kind of come to be the way that they are, but also really where things are going in terms of genre, how those things are kind of folding in on each other. In other words, guys, from, Aristotle to today, genres are a very interesting thing to talk about. And I'm sure it's not the last time we'll talk about genres in video games or in films or in any of those other kinds of things here in the Weekly Wringer. But when we talk about your least favorite genres, I had a few guesses as to what those things might be. Some of those turned out to be correct. Others of you kind of shocked me a little bit in the choices that you made. And but that's okay. That's what the Weekly Wringer is all about. It's about a conversation. It's about a discussion surrounding the specific elements. And I'm very glad to take the time to see what you guys think about your least favorite things sometimes, as much as I'm interested in asking about your most favorite things sometimes. It is cool to talk about the worst things as much as it is to talk about the best things sometimes. Just ask some of those folks out there that have made a career out of talking about really, really awful things. I won't get into specifics on that. Let's move right along to our first contribution and answer to the question. your least favorite genre, which was Jabberwock, which, really it presented an interesting answer for me, which is simulation. Now, there are many different forms of simulation. They were covered throughout the comments for last week's Ringer. Many of you went a little bit deeper and you got into some of the levels of simulation that you like versus other forms. But I think it's interesting to talk about simulation as a genre in general. And there are a lot of different ways to look at this. But I think for what I could gather from what Jabberwock was talking about, it's more like The Sims, right? And The Sims is a brilliant game, but I have to say, I've never really felt the compelling drive to play The Sims. And part of the reason, I think, is exactly why Jabberwock talks about today. Kind of ask the question, why? Why do the mundane things of The Sims, right? Why kind of sit there and watch a person live life when I can just kind of live life on my own? I can go to work and come back, and I can sit on the couch, or I could make dinner, or I could, drive a car or rob a bank. I mean, I wouldn't do that. I'm just saying, I could if I wanted to, although that would be really stupid. But, you guys get the point, right? Because a simulation game, after all, and I think about one of the first simulation games I ever played, which was a game called Little Computer People. I had it for Commodore 64. And, after I played it for about 5 or 6 minutes, and it took 5 or 6 minutes to load. So I had already kind of doubled my time on the game. But, it was kind of confusing, I have to say, because it was so mundane. And so for some of the simulation, I couldn't agree more. I think it is kind of crazy. But there are other elements of simulation that I like. I think this is pretty neat. Like SimCity, for example, where you're kind of doing city planning. And you're really talking about the ways that roads will interact, and infrastructure, and planning, and amenities for people and citizens and things like that. I think that's cool. Some of that is strategy, so it's a little bit of a strategy game as well. But really, the sim whatever, right, is short for simulation after all. And so it kind of is the poster child for the simulation genre. And I think that's a good point. Sometimes when games simulate life too well, we're going to hear a couple more opinions about that as we move on through this week's Weekly Ringer. Sometimes when simulation and video games simulate life too well, they're not very fun and they're not very compelling. I'm not, for any of you that play The Sims and love The Sims, good for you. I'm not here to tell you what you should or shouldn't like, but I do think that I certainly understand the argument that simulation is kind of the worst or least favorite genre, just because it's, it can be, or has the tendency to be a little mundane. All right, unseasonably shocked me a little bit, don't mind telling you, by talking about the FPS. And, this is interesting to me because FPS is obviously one of the most heavily, visited and worn genres in the history of video gaming, right? We've talked about it many times here on the Weekly Ringer. But FPSs are, in large part, or I guess I shouldn't say that. I should say that in many ways, FPSs are directly responsible for some of the popularity, the sheer popularity of video games today. If it weren't for some of those FPSs along the way, I don't think video games would be nearly as popular today as they would have been otherwise, which is part of Unseasonably's argument against them. I think one of the things that we have to look at in terms of gaming is whether we like a certain genre by virtue of who it brings to the table. Now, I've talked many times about games that were more casual in nature. That's not necessarily a genre, but more of a casual kind of a game, right? That invited people that never would have played games otherwise. And that can be a great thing. Or to some of you, I think it's kind of disparaging. You don't really like that idea. That, in some ways, diminishes what it means to be a gamer. Not to go back, 2 weeks on the Weekly Ringer, but we did talk about that a little bit. Unseasonably's problem with FPS, among other things, is that it brings a lot of the bros into gaming. I have to say, I don't like to be stereotypical here on the Weekly Ringer or in anything that I do for the Clan of the Grey Wolf. But I have to say, unseasonably, I agree with you wholeheartedly. You know, it's one of the things I've been trying to put my finger on for a while. Madden is the same way. We're going to get to sports games. Don't you guys worry. But, you know, Madden is the same way that some of the gray games, right? You know, Call of Duty, Modern Warfare, you know, any of their derivatives, you know, throughout the ages, let's say, have brought a lot of people to the gaming table that never would have been there otherwise. And I find those things that to be kind of directly to blame for some of the crappy activity out there on Xbox Live. I blame it for some of the negative stereotypes that people have against video gamers in general. Because a lot of times the people that come and sit down and play them are people that are less than desirable in real life. But for those of us that are normal, well-adjusted, wonderful human beings, like all of you who watch the Weekly Ringer, I don't pander to my audience at all, by the way. You guys are, you know, all of us that are well-adjusted and play video games at the same time, I think see some of the audiences that some of these games bring in, and we do get a little bit of a bad taste in our mouth. That being said, I don't think, even with all of that, I'm not sure I could agree with FPS being my least favorite genre, even if it does bring a lot of bros to the gaming table, and even if it is kind of repetition of the same form and not a lot of innovative structure and so on and so forth, which I think are all very good points. Just not sure I can get on board with that. Let's see, we're moving right along. Lord of Nothing. Notice I didn't say the Lord of Nothing. Lord of Nothing talked about the idea of sports games being the least favorite genre for many, many reasons, but I think the biggest one is the rehash factor, right? Really, sports games don't do a lot of innovation. There's a lot of sports games out there, a ton of them, but they really kind of work on old premises, right? They deal with the same kind of gameplay, and then you'll have that kind of stretch of gameplay for a few years, and then a feature will come along that'll kind of make it better again, but that doesn't stop them from making a Madden game every year, you know, an NHL game every year, a FIFA game every year. And so what we find in sports games then is that it really does get fairly tiring. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know many people that buy every single iteration of one of those games, besides some of the folks that we were just talking about with the FPS, with, you know, the bros, the folks that are just kind of like, yeah, man, let's play games and stuff, like eat pizza. Sorry, again, not trying to be stereotypical, just throwing it out there. I think that sports games definitely survive and thrive the way that they do because there are people that are out there that don't play any other game at all. The only reason they own a gaming system is to play sports games. And I can't get behind that, guys. I just can't get behind that initiative. Sorry. That being said, I've played some great sports games in my time, and I've seen some great and innovative sports games in the past, and I would love to see that again. Case in point, Tecmo Super Bowl. Need I say more? So I'm not sure I can group everything together as my least favorite genre as the sports games, just because I played so many great sports games. And, you know, you need only go to NBA Jam to see another great case in point there, which some of you actually mentioned. The Male White Mage lost a few points with me this time to talk about point-and-click adventures, which any of you that know a lot about the Weekly Ringer or have watched for a while know is one of my favorite genres of all time. It's dying. It's one of those things that we talked about on the Weekly Ringer before about have we witnessed the death of the adventure game, and especially the point-and-click adventure game. And I think there's a good argument that we have. However, the Male White Mage talks about this being the least you know, his least desirable genre, and I think that definitely is a matter of preference, because if I'm objective about it and I take away my own personal affinity for point-and-click adventure games,